Excellent. You have 30 minutes. You have 30 minutes for the cross-border special interest group. I think you're together with Paul. Yep.
I brought some glamorous assistants with me.
Excellent. Go for it.
Okay, I will do that. Let me try and share my screen. You see my screen?
Yes, seeing your screen.
Excellent. Okay, so I will just briefly start off, and then I will hand over to Aaron J, who will be talking about addressing. We'll hand over to Paul to talk about compliance, and then I'll finish up with a little light messaging and settling stuff. Okay, so what sorts of things we want to talk about here? Well, we've got different kinds of cross-border. First of all, the single scheme, multiple jurisdictions. That's the old Mawali case, if you recall it. Then multiple schemes in a single jurisdiction. And finally, multiple schemes in multiple jurisdictions. Jurisdictions here is intended to mean countries. So this one's nice. It's an all-modulic solution. We need to be able to provide currency conversion within the scheme, though not for all transfers. Everybody talks the same language, FSPIL. And there's a single source of address resolution, which typically will be the scheme's oracles. For multiple schemes in a single jurisdiction, we would need to be able to accommodate both modular loop and non-modular loop schemes. We don't have any currency conversion issues because it's a single jurisdiction, but we may have different regulatory regimes, particularly if we're dealing with schemes that have different kinds of participants. And finally, different schemes may use different messaging conventions because it may be that one of them uses ISO 20022 and one uses FSPIL. Finally, for the scheme where there are multiple schemes and multiple jurisdictions, basically we have to solve all of the problems. So we will try at least to start by solving the easy problems and go to the more difficult ones. I will stop sharing now and hand you over to Paul, who will introduce Aaron J.
Aaron J, are you there?
Indeed, I am.
Good, glad to hear it. Can we pass over to you to talk a little about the addressing work that we're doing within this cross-border SIG?
Yep, absolutely. Great. So at UNCDF, we are about to publish a technical paper on proxy addressing, which has been extensively reviewed by the community, as in greater than the modular community, should I say the payment industry. Most of the main players in the private sector, a number of central banks, and a number of people within the modular community. So that's at the final stages and will be published early next month or sometime next month, we're expecting. The paper itself details the concept of proxy addressing system service, which I could describe as a global gateway to connect existing directories, modular oracles being one of them. And what it would do is essentially use existing proxy or aliases that are in use in domestic networks and use them, allow them to be used cross-border. So that's the goal. And to that end, we are going to run a proof of concept later this year and test that to work with a minimum of 3 networks, one of them being Moduloop, another is a global private sector partner, and the third is a crypto network. So that's where the initiative currently is, and happy to answer any questions.
Maybe we can leave any questions till the end, unless anyone's got any burning question for the moment. But thank you for that. We will be talking a little more about PASS tomorrow, as we have a work stream dedicated to it. Sam and myself will be introducing that. In the meantime, I'm going to move on to the next item in this work stream. I think Michael mentioned at the beginning that there are actually 4 sub-work streams here. There's payments addressing, there's compliance, there's messaging, and the settlement. And each has its own mini work stream lead. And I am the mini work stream lead for compliance. So I'm going to talk you through compliance and what we've been thinking here. And I'm sure you'll all agree that compliance is an extremely interesting subject. As I'm talking to a room full of payments professionals, I guarantee you'll all be extremely familiar with the FATF recommendations, all 40 of them. These FATF recommendations have been around for around 30 years now, something like that. And they effectively, it's an international body which together defines the standards for monitoring for money laundering and defining the countermeasures for money laundering and funding terrorism, etc., etc. They politely call them recommendations, but they're absolutely anything but. If you as a country choose not to comply with the FATF recommendations, then you become an Iran or a similar renegade state. The FATF recommendations only actually apply to cross-border transactions, but there is an inevitable bleed through to domestic compliance requirements. So they're not to be ignored. Most of the recommendations are aimed at governments, financial and supervisory authorities. So we only need to be concerned with the effects of those supervisory authorities, but there are some which are actually defined as things which financial entities really must do. Mojaloop as a switch operator is not directly implicated in these, but we need to be able to support our participant DFSPs in their compliance requirements. So I'm going to quickly go through some of the most relevant documentations. Before you all die of boredom, I promise I'm not going to go through each of these. I'm simply going to tell you roughly what that means for us. Having said that, I would actually say that the FATF recommendations are some of the most well-written government or financial service sets of documentation I've ever come across, and I would recommend reading them. So first of all, FATF recommendation 10, that's the first one which directly impacts on us. It's about customer due diligence, and it falls into 2 areas. So first, financial institutions have to carry out customer due diligence. Nowhere in FATF does it mention KYC, by the way. KYC is completely subsumed into the world of customer due diligence, which is KYC on steroids. So when you're opening accounts, when you're carrying out transactions which might be deemed potentially suspicious, or whether you think there's money laundering going on, or you think that maybe the customer data that's been provided is perhaps not real, you have to do a huge level of customer due diligence processing. What do you have to do? You have to identify the customer, verify that customer's identity, and that's the difference between KYC and CDD. It's not just about providing your passport. You have to go off somewhere else and get loads of corroborating information. Identifying the beneficial owner. Is this person who's just come up trying to open a bank account actually acting on behalf of somebody else? And you have to be able to really find out who actually will control this account. Understand the purpose of opening the account and the intended nature of the business relationship, and you have to conduct ongoing due diligence. It's not just a one-off process. You have to regularly repeat the process, and as I've highlighted here, scrutiny of transactions. So transaction monitoring is kind of hidden in all of that. I should say, by the way, these are just abbreviated forms of the recommendations. Each of the recommendations not only is quite lengthy in itself, but it comes with its own guides book, if you like. This is the real stuff you need to know about FATF Recommendation 10, for example, is the rubric behind it. And it's still interesting, but it just does make it quite lengthy. So 11, record keeping. You have to maintain for at least 5 years all necessary documentation on transactions and on any data retrieved during the CDD process. All I need to say about that. Politically exposed persons, PEPs, keep away from them. It's where somebody controls a large financial organization, or whether they're a relatively senior government official, anybody like that, you need to know that they are in that position, and you have to decide whether or not to actually take them on as a customer because of the additional money laundering risk, and you have to carry out existing enhanced monitoring of that relationship. Correspondent banking. When you are trying to establish a link to a financial institution in another country, you have to actually decide whether they are an institution that is in good standing. So you have to know about the reputation of the institution and the quality of supervision. And that's an interesting one, because it effectively means that you, as Bank A in country A, have to take a view on how good the regulator is in country B and whether they're doing their job properly before you engage with the bank. Because unless you can be sure that the quality of supervision is good, then you should not be dealing with any bank in country B. And FATF have a whole structure around how you decide whether the regulators in another country are doing a good job. It's called the FSRBs. FATF love their acronyms. And all of the other stuff that you have to do. I promised I wouldn't go through it all. Wire transfers. This is really interesting for us. It's directly relevant to us. Countries have to ensure that financial institutions include required and accurate originator information and all the required beneficiary information on wire transfers and related messages, and that the information remains with the wire transfer throughout the payment chain. Countries have to ensure, in other words, this is the regulator, have to ensure that financial institutions monitor wire transfers for the purpose of detecting those which lack required originator and or beneficiary information. So we have to see when a transaction comes through Mojloop and is headed over that border, we have to take a view on whether to allow that transaction if it doesn't include information about the originator or the beneficiary. And frankly, the sensible approach is don't, unless you want to spend a lot of time in court. The information that has to be provided with the wire transfer: the name of the originator account number, the originator's address or national identity number, or customer identification number. That's interesting. It means a customer identifier within the originator bank, for example. Date and place of birth are also allowed. The name of the beneficiary and the beneficiary account number. They do allow for, in the absence of an account, a unique transaction reference number, which we will be generating anyway. I'm sensing I'm losing my audience here, so I'll move on quickly. There are pages of this stuff, and I can talk to you about this later. Let's just go straight to what does it mean for us. Okay. We're not an FSP, so what do we need to do? Well, first of all, we have to ensure that all integrations with FSPs include provision for the transaction metadata. That's recommendation 16. We have to be able to support these banks in their compliance requirements. Ensure that transaction metadata is propagated end-to-end, in as far as it is in our control. Where a transaction is international and transaction metadata is missing, then we have to have the hub operator has to have a risk-based policy to decide whether to accept or reject that transaction. I would actually say you should just reject it, but that's for a particular hub operator to decide. Consider recommendation 13 when seeking international partners. Does that bank look a bit dubious? Does that regulatory authority look somewhat less than diligent? Transactions have to be monitored. So everyone in the value chain of a transaction, you have to store the transactions, and you have to raise. And when you're monitoring them, if you see something that looks a bit dubious, you have to raise a suspicious transaction report, and you have to raise that with the FIU, the Financial Intelligence Unit. If I'd gone through the whole thing, every country is mandated to create a financial intelligence unit in order to support this monitoring in their country and store all transaction data for at least 5 years. If you do all that, you're golden. So great. And that's it. Unless there are any questions, I'll pass back to Michael. There's a question from Jonathan.
Yes, I thank you very much, Paul, for that presentation, for that good presentation. So my name is Jonathan from Comesa Business Council. I think, as you are aware, we are also quite interested in this POC for the Comesa region, especially now we are focusing to start with Zambia and Malawi up until we join the other countries. But my question now is on the open. Of course, I'm fairly new, so maybe forgive me if I may not ask the right question. But on the open source FX component, how are we managing on that one? Because if you look, like especially in the Comesa countries, Forex is a very big issue when it comes to cross-border transactions, and also that would be one of the pain points that would be interested to solve. So I want to understand more on the open source FX component. How is the work around that area? Thank you.
Can I take that, Paul?
Please.
Just to say that we have a presentation specifically on FX and the FX component tomorrow, Jonathan. So I'll be dealing with that in a lot more detail, if that's okay. Otherwise,
that's fine.
Okay, fine. Right.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
No problem.
Hey, Paul, this is Greg.
Hi, Greg.
I raised my hand. You ignored me, so I'm going to talk anyway. The only way to do that is you're going to have to make the regulators happy on both sides. So these people are going to have to be pre-authorized. There needs to be a register for that, and we're going to have to stop it otherwise. At the moment, though, as Miller said, we're not interdicting for Mojaloup as far as what we're doing, but we can do that. We can stop it, but more importantly, I'd stop the transaction before it gets too far down the chain. They're on the list of being authorized providers or not, and that's something we can all work with you on. So we'll go down the journey together.
Yeah, with regard to Miller's point, I'd say that what we seek to do in transaction monitoring is to allow it to go through, because we don't have the opportunity to stop it really, not in real time. But FRMS.io provides a score, and that score will be used to decide whether or not to raise an STR. That would be my expectation. In terms of rejecting transactions, that's only where the metadata is missing, I would say. And we can do that as part of the standard transaction processing.
And I would make the higher level point that it is up to the scheme to decide how it deals with FATF regulations and how it deals with fraud, but that there's an underlying bias, which is that the scheme does not take responsibility for fraud management. It is the banks and the licensees that do. Yeah. And so in that case, the scheme isn't going to reject anything generally, unless all of the participants agree that the scheme may reject it without consequence or liability. I don't know how you would write that, frankly. So I suspect that if a transaction is proposed, then that transaction will proceed. If the transaction doesn't have the correct metadata in it, it would be rejected as malformed, not because it's fraud. If you don't present the correct information to the switch that it needs to process that transaction under scheme rules, it would, of course, have to be rejected. But it's not because the switch needs the information, and it's not because that might be fraudulent. We wouldn't be making that judgment. I think that the key is here to separate the opinionated bias of the FATF group from that which is needed to actually move money, and to be clear that what you're doing is in two different camps. We can move money even if it was for an illegitimate purpose. The trick is to not do that, but that is really pushed back to the FSPs to not propose such transactions in the first place, and to take advantage of any shared fraud information that can be provided to them during the agreement phase, so that they have the most information available by both sides that would allow them to make a risk-based judgment about whether to proceed with a prepared transfer. But the scheme just transfers money. It's under its own agreement and its own rules.
There's a whole load of discussions to be had around the FATF recommendations and whether they're too strict and the effect they've had on the financial community. And it's by no means good. And I think it's fair to say that in the early days, FATF was over-prescriptive, and then the banking community overreacted. But the FATF took a step back a little, but the financial community hasn't necessarily taken the same step back. But we need to be able to support the banks in their compliance. We are not actually the compliant body. We're not actually subject to the same supervision, but we have to allow them, the banks themselves, to demonstrate that they are compliant with the FATF recommendations.
Yeah, so
it's also worth adding, I think, in relation to that the FRMS, or indeed any risk management system, will be working on a very small set of data when it comes to evaluate transfers that are coming in from other schemes.
Yeah,
as far as your data,
which is why it should be limited to raising STRs, not actually intermediate.
But again, now let's be careful here. The STR is never raised by the scheme; it's always raised by the institution that represents the customer. And I want to get to that point that what we're saying is that the facilitation of the bank's needs in this environment is what we're after, but it is the scheme rules that are in general the place where you consequently identify what has to be done by the scheme and what is left to the participants to do. It's not the code. We want to be sure the code wouldn't care in the end, and that it's not placing a biased requirement on the participants of all deployments. It would say you may configure the system to work within your scheme rules to meet your requirements. And I think that's a key separation of concerns. It was key to the design of MotionLoop in the first place, of saying, we don't care what the transaction says. If you tell us who to pay, how much, and what currency, we will clear that payment. It is up to the agreement phase to decide why you're making the payment. And it is up to the individual initiating participant to decide whether to initiate. If it doesn't initiate, then the payment doesn't happen, and hence fraud can't happen. So it really is a question of making sure we go at that level. But thank you.
And that's where we're hoping to stop it. Actually, Miller, is that more at that level by adding allow lists and things like that to go through. And you guys would never even see the transaction. The DFSP would stop it first and have more of a centralized scheme. But it's all going to be different depending on the region, the area, how banks interpret stuff, things like that. It'll need to be very, very flexible. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'll hand over to Michael.
Well, yes, thank you, Paul. I note that the fascinating topic of compliance has eaten up all but the last 3 minutes of our presentation. So I will be proceeding at speed, somewhat mollified by the idea that, in fact, both of these areas will be covered in more detail in presentations tomorrow, so it shouldn't be that bad. But anyway, let's go. Okay, so settling in a multi-currency environment. Let me talk first of all about liquidity cover and settling. Generally speaking, an obligation can only have one currency. It's always an obligation in a particular currency. In cross-border transfers, however, a payment may pass through several schemes and indeed several currencies. So that will essentially, as a consequence of the first point, create multiple obligations in different currencies. And in some sense, at least, liquidity will need to be guaranteed and settlement will need to be made for each of those obligations. Let me talk a little bit about liquidity provision. Liquidity provision is designed to avoid credit risk. And credit risk is the risk that the beneficiary, FSP, takes when it gives money to a customer, a beneficiary customer, before it receives it in the process of settlement from the sending institution, the debtor institution. That's what credit risk is. We get around that, and a lot of other IPSs do the same, by requiring that the debtor DFSP should make a guarantee, a verifiable guarantee, that they have the funds to cover the settlement of every payment, and therefore they will never default on a payment in the process of settlement. In a cross-border world, it may be more difficult to establish who the debtor DFSP is or should be, and what currency the liquidity needs to be provided in. Does that sound familiar? Well, this is how correspondent banking works today. So we might articulate our objective as find a way to do correspondent banking, which works between IPSs for small DFSPs in emerging markets and developing economies. And that's the problem that we have at the moment. So looking across at this, there is a key performance indicator for in the financial stability area for what these transfers, cross-currency transfers, should do. For retail, it should be 1% of the global average cost of payments, with no corridors costing more than 3%. For remittances, should be no more than 3%, with no corridors with costs higher than 5%. But there are significant barriers in the world which stop that happening now. First of all, settlement risk. The risk that liquidity is not available when it's required, and particularly this is high for emerging market currencies at the moment. Using correspondent banking is typically foreign exchange trades involving EMDE economies involve multiple transaction legs. Second, there's a question of settlement duration. If a payment is going through several currencies, then very often those payments will be made by RTGSs in the various countries, which are operating on different, sometimes quite restricted timetables, and synchronizing all of those may lead to a considerable delay in the settlement being effected. It's not easy to access liquidity in some emerging market currencies. And finally, there are regulatory challenges. Now, Paul's already talked about the FATF regulations, but of course, every country is at liberty to enhance those in whatever ways it sees fit. And some countries, should we say, have been quite enthusiastic in their approach to that. So really, we think that there are two approaches. The standard way assumes that the process will continue to focus around correspondent banking. It concentrates on improving the performance and availability of RTGSs and says that indirect access via proxies is the answer to the problems of small institutions, because typically small institutions, such as the ones we very frequently want to deal with, people like MFIs, SACCOs, those kinds of people, don't get access to RTGSs. Typically that is banks only, in some countries banks plus mobile money systems. So that's one way of doing it. The Mojaloop way, we think, is to find a way to remove the indirection premium. That's the premium that small businesses or small institutions, small financial institutions pay to get access to the settling process, as we've just said. And finally, we want to propose efficient ways of trading off between credit risk and liquidity provision. There are different models to settle a cross-border payment system via CBDC, but we're going to have a separate conversation about CBDC tomorrow, so I am going to leave that slide with your permission, and you can have a look at it tomorrow. Now, let me get on to messaging. ISO 20002 seems to be the emerging standard for both for schemes and for cross-border inter-scheme payments. For this to work effectively for our world, we need a number of additional things. First of all, as we've said a number of times, and I'll be saying again tomorrow, we need agreement from the standards body for the changes that we need to support the way in which we work. We also need a simple and comprehensive way for small DFSPs, again, the SACOs, the MFIs, to use ISO 20002 messaging, because the messages are large, complex, and it's not always easy to understand how you should operate them. And finally, we need a way of harmonizing ISO 20002 usage. I hear you say, isn't ISO 20002 a standard? Well, the answer is sort of. It's based around messages, and each message has a specific business purpose. There's no requirement that you actually use it for that purpose. And you will often hear people say, people in the ISO community who might know better, say, well, you could use this message over here for what you want, to which we often not infrequently reply, but it says it's for something different. Anyway, messages are built around a small core of required fields and a very large number of optional fields. So to take an example, I did some analysis once, and the number of required fields for a particular message were around 10, the total number of fields around 2,000. So individual IPSs are bound to make their own decisions about which optional fields they require or forbid. And when they do that, there's no requirement in the ISO standard for those decisions to be communicated back to the standard organization, and no obvious way to interrogate the requirements of a particular IPS to find out what flavor it's using. I mean, apart from taking down their set of rules and reading through it. Now, we asked, doesn't Moduloop solve this problem? Well, almost, or sort of. So the idea is that we will provide a generic proposal for restricting the use of the ISO 20002 message portfolio that we support. We expect that individual implementers of Moduloop schemes may further qualify this proposal because they will have their own particular circumstances, and in the same way as any implementer of a Moduloop scheme goes through a process by which it decides how it wants to use that scheme, that how you want to use that scheme will eventually issue, we expect, in qualifications to the original proposal. This may be a particular problem because the set of data that ISO 20002 provides is very rich, and particularly with respect to KYC. So why does this matter, we ask ourselves? Well, we could just use an adapter in principle, but unfortunately, we use message structure and content to manage non-repudiation. And in any case, we would still need some way for senders to understand what information receivers required of them. Now, a possible way forward in this area might be safe to assume that a given ISO field is univocal in a message, i.e. that when you have a particular field, it always means something, always means roughly the same thing. That may not be a safe assumption, particularly because we know of cases where individual schemes have picked up ISO messages and cannibalized them for their own purposes. But in principle, we could probably use that as a starting point. Or at least we could produce a set of Moduloop definitions saying that as far as we're concerned, this is what these fields mean. If that were the case, then participants could request information from each other, for instance, by including blank fields representing the information they required. And field content could be negotiated using the agreement of terms process. So effectively, when a data party requested agreement of terms, it could put together the fields that it required for KYC purposes, for instance, and send that to the creditor institution, which should interpret that as an instruction saying, please fill these fields in with the information that you have. So that would result in either a reliably agreed set of terms or a mutual recognition that the payment can't be made. However, it's important to notice that this will place quite a scheme like this would place quite a considerable burden on payment manager implementations. So my conclusion from that is that even if ISO 20002 becomes a standard, there will still be quite a long way to go for us and indeed for everybody else who's involved in cross-border and cross-scheme payments to arrive at a workable solution. That's all I have to say. A mere 8 minutes late. Any questions? Oh, sorry. Over by 6 minutes, Simeon.
I'll hold the questions, Michael, but if there are any questions, please pop them in the chat, and then Michael and Paul, you guys can respond in the chat, if that's okay with you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely fine with me. I will look forward to receiving. Yes, provided I can get to the chat, because I've had to drop off now and come back, and I think I lose the chat if I do that, don't I?
Okay, awesome. No worries. I think
so. Well, as long as you can save the chat somewhere,
yeah,
then great. Okay.
I'll make sure you do.
Thank you very much.
Bye.